the Sunday Express, and Sonia Sodha of The Observer as well. So let's start off with Sir Ivan. I mean, clearly the papers are aligning themselves, aren't they, depending on which stance they took during the referendum campaign. Caroline, are you surprised by any of the papers' tones?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, for weeks, for months now, every story pretty much that we've written around the subject of the European Union has been written through the prism of Brexit. So it's hardly surprising that, the Times is sort of bemoaning the loss of Sir Rodgers, who's basically left for pastures new.
Your paper, of course, has its own particular prism here as well.
Absolutely. The Daily Express and the Sunday Express were supporting Brexit, and I think our sister paper today has basically said it's a great opportunity for Britain to, in essence, find somebody who's supportive of the sort of Brexit narrative to sort of move things forward as it goes. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, they do say that he was a pessimist here, and there was some criticism of Sir Ivan for his sort of stance when David Cameron was trying to sort of make his renegotiation in Europe, basically suggesting that he hadn't been tough enough. So the suggestion that the Daily Mail then makes is that actually it's time for him to move aside and to get somebody who's going to have much more of a positive narrative and be much tougher as we trigger Article 50 and move forward.
It's fair to say, Sonia, isn't it? I mean, his fingerprints were over it. Sir Ivan can't say, all of this happened in a vacuum. He was there, not maybe his hand completely on the steering wheel, but he was obviously an important player in the negotiations.
Well, he was there, but I think the Times is wrong here to imply that perhaps the deal that David Cameron got wasn't good enough because of the hand of, Ivan Rodgers. I just don't think that's right at all. I think if you look at the dynamics around the European Union, the way it was playing out, it was very clear that Cameron was never going to get enough to be able to say to the British public, I fundamentally renegotiated the deal. That was just never going to be on the table. So I think it's a bit unfair to lay that at the door of Ivan Rodgers. And I think it's incredibly worrying, the manner in which he's left, for a couple of reasons. First of all, as the Times points out, he's a diplomat who really knows the other side who we're going to be negotiating with inside out. And that's absolutely critical to Britain trying to get the best deal that it possibly can, understanding where Europe is on this. I think the second worrying thing that it implies is that, it seems like his hand may have been forced a bit, like he felt like he had to go because ministers were unhappy that he was giving them frank advice behind the scenes. And I think that says something very worrying about the political neutrality of the civil service. The fact that you've got papers now saying, brilliant, this is our chance to get a pro-Brexit diplomat. That's not the point of a politically neutral civil service.
But of course there was also a concern that his term was coming to an end in November, although there was sort of precedence to suggest he would have stayed on for a bit longer. The suggestion being actually it would have been a very difficult time to have lost him after we triggered Article 50 and be starting to move forward with those negotiations.
In terms of how the papers are dealing with it, though, do you think we may be heading down the enemies of the people territory, where the judges were targeted? Do you think now, civil service mandarins are going to be targeted as well and have their private lives raked over and, every pronouncement looked at to see whether they're Brexiters or Remainers?
Well, I think there's been a certain degree of that happening already. If you remember the rows concerning like Sir Jeremy Hayward, for example, before even the European referendum had happened. I mean, whether it actually comes to actually going along and looking at their private lives, I'm not so sure. But I think, there is genuine public interest in this as a subject area and whether or not, the direction of travel of the government. And part of that is kind of the problem lies by the fact that the government is keeping so much of this so close to its chest that literally everything that happens and every utterance that's made by anybody in the public sphere is being sort of raked over and looked at again to see if there's any nuance in it that gives us any clue as to the direction of travel.
And I think the really worrying thing about this is that senior civil servants have to feel like they can give frank advice to ministers behind closed doors, and then they must implement what ministers want.
Stripes.
Absolutely. And I think the really worrying thing about this whole affair is that it suggests, the tone of Ivan Rodgers' email to people in his department that's been leaked, it suggests that, civil servants may not feel like they can give that frank advice to ministers behind closed doors anymore. And that's very worrying for a negotiation if ministers appear to only want to hear the good news. That's not the way we're going to get to a good outcome for Britain.
On the subject of outcomes, good or bad, let's have a look at this cartoon of Jeremy Corbyn enjoying Das Capital on a desert island before being drowned in the wake of what Len McCluskey said, where in effect he said that in 2019, if the polls were still as bad as they are now, then Jeremy Corbyn, he inferred that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell may vacate their jobs, let's say that. The Fabian Society suggesting that they could be facing electoral wipeout. Sonia, you were former senior policy advisor to Ed Miliband. If you were sitting next to Jeremy Corbyn right now, because we've heard talk about a New Year
I'd love
reset,
to be sitting on a desert island on January the 4th, can I just say?
But sitting next to Jeremy Corbyn on that desert island, what advice would you be giving Jeremy Corbyn now about the reset that we've heard mooted?
Would you give him a little push into the sea?
I would be wearing a very big raincoat with those two ships heading towards you. I can say that. No, I think it's in some ways it's unsurprising that we're seeing very, very strong critique of Jeremy Corbyn at the moment from all wings of the Labour Party, whether it's Len McCluskey saying what he did, whether it's a Fabian Society, a Labour-affiliated think tank, saying it's looking increasingly impossible for Labour to win the next general election, which I don't think comes as a surprise to any observer of politics. And that's because Labour are doing so badly in the polls. To be fair to Corbyn, one of the points that the Fabian Society makes is that it's partly about Corbyn, but Corbyn is to some extent a symptom of these massive structural problems that the Labour Party faces, particularly around Brexit. So, Labour is sort of holding together an electoral coalition of people who voted to remain in the European Union and to leave. And it's finding it very difficult as a result of that to come up with a very clear policy on Brexit itself. And it's losing support from people who supported leaving the European Union at a faster rate from those who remain. So it's very difficult to see how Labour holds that coalition together, Jeremy Corbyn, or indeed any other leader, really.
Caroline Wheeler, do you think that too much stress is perhaps put on the leader by perhaps the Sunday Express, for example, just to pluck a newspaper out of off the shelf?
Well, obviously our readers aren't going to be Labour supporters generally. But I think that what you're saying is very interesting. I think in terms of the narrative around Brexit, Labour really has lost its voice in terms of, where it goes, because it just hasn't been sort of vociferous enough in the message that it has. Is it supporting the position and the status quo that we have now, is that we're leaving the European Union, or does it want us to have a second referendum? And that message has kind of got very fudged, which is, I think, why we've seen some of the by-election results that we've seen recently. They've generally been different results, but it's actually been Labour that have kind of lost out. I do think it's interesting here what Len McCluskey says, because I think that it's not just about the polling that's going on, it's also about the very personal fight that he's waging against Gerard Coyne, who is standing against him for the General Secretary's position, and he's much more moderate. So, of course, I think he has to slightly modify his language, Len, otherwise he's going to get into a position where it becomes a sort of battle of the pro-Corbynistas and the anti-Corbynistas.
Len McCluskey moderating his language, whatever next. Caroline Wheeler and Sonia Sodha, both thank you very much indeed for coming in this morning. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next.